Thank you for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. Once again, it's an honor to have Rabbi Shmuel Phillips on for the second time. The first time we had you on, we were promoting your book, Judaism Reclaimed, and now, thank God, we have another book to discuss, which is Talmud Reclaimed. We're very excited to have this conversation. Before we get into the questions, can you tell us a little bit about the book, what inspired you to write it, a little bit about the book?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you very much for having me back on your podcast. I very much enjoyed the previous time, and I'm sure we're going to enjoy this as well. So, yeah, Talmud Reclaimed. Well, what is it? What is being reclaimed? How is it being reclaimed? Well, the truth is that there are many people I find, even those who've spent years in the yeshiva world, in the kollel system, and there are certain questions they have, I think, which anyone has when they start studying Talmud, basic structural questions which you'd have with any law students. How does something become law? How does the law change? What is legal authority? And these are basic questions which they don't really deal with very much in the yeshivot. And I mean, I was just at a Shabbat lunch yesterday, and someone sort of mentioned I'd written a book, and there were two yeshiva guys there, and they basically turned to each other and said, we were up half of last night discussing these questions and talking about how there aren't any books that really address them properly in English. So yeah, so I tried to go through some of the basic questions. The first section of the book discusses, first of all, I mean, if you take the Talmud and the Masechet of Gemara, how much of that is understood to have come from Sinai? How much of that came directly from God via Moshe and has been passed through the generations? And how much of that has been legislated by the Sanhedrin or the sages via the Sanhedrin through the generations? How much of that can be changed and how much of it is fixed? If a new Sanhedrin sets up tomorrow, which laws can they revisit and which things are considered to be off limits? Surely there are red lines, things they can't change, and many things that they can. And connected to that comes the question of the drashot, all of the legal hermeneutical processes that take up so much of the Talmud, extracting apparently laws from the verses to add this law and that law. How much are we trying to mine the hidden intent of the Torah to legislate new details of laws, and how much are we, or how much are the sages creating or applying old laws and just finding places for it within the Torah's text? So there's discussion about that, and there's a matter of how to tell one part from the other. Which parts of the Gemara are part of the core transmitted elements of the oral tradition, and how much are the legislated details? That's the first section. And the second section moves into the post-Talmudic era, an era we don't have a Sanhedrin, we don't have a judicial authority which is authorized to create new law. So how does law change, if at all, in the post-Talmudic era? And there are different traditions on how flexible law can be in this era. We discuss the different styles of Talmud study, how that has evolved over the years, and also the big question of academic Talmud study, how they study Talmud in the universities, as opposed to how they study it in the yeshivot, and how each could perhaps learn from the other or not. So these are some of the big questions, as well as the historical matters of how the Talmud came to be written, how it came to be considered authoritative. So yeah, many big questions are dealt with.
It really is like probably the only book out there, like you said, that really addresses all these issues. So to anyone, who's tuning in right now, we both highly recommend reading this book. We're not going to be able to cover all the topics in this one podcast, so we really recommend it. So you touched on this topic, so I guess we'll start with this. In the opening chapter, you discuss the state of halakha today and how we have subconsciously come to revere the halachic status quo so much that we're almost uncomfortable thinking about or suggesting how to reclaim and employ in the future the original legislative power of the Sanhedrin. Can you discuss some of the key points that make the Sanhedrin so unique and central to the halachic system, and why without the Sanhedrin, the modern world is stuck in what you call a quote-unquote halachic exile?
Right, these are big topics. I mean, the first point as an introductory point is just to understand what halakha is. Halakha is a national legal system for the Jewish people. And any legal system has to have some kind of judicial body to interpret and to determine the details, address new scenarios. We have it in the Torah, tells us al pi Torah she'arucha, that we keep the laws of the Torah in accordance with how the judges present them to us. So we're told we have a judicial body. And before we go into the unique aspects of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish judicial body, just to appreciate how any legal system requires a judicial body to interpret the laws for us, for even very seemingly simple laws. Do not kill sounds like a very simple, easy to apply law. You can't go and kill other people. Well, no. We know how much debate there is in America now about what's considered a living being. What is considered life? At what stage, if at all, is a fetus considered fully alive and being forbidden to kill a fetus? The end of life, we have a similar debate with the organ donation. At what stage is someone considered no longer to be alive? You can take the organs out of the body without worrying about killing them. So these are new questions somewhat that didn't really exist at the time of the Mishnah and the Gemara, which we would need the Sanhedrin to come and define for us. What about self-defense? It's a big question in Israel now. Under what circumstances, what level of risk can you go, and when you believe someone's attacking you, go and shoot them? These are big, big questions which a seemingly simple law, do not kill, will bring up. And we have complex laws about not doing malachot on Shabbat, and many of the scenarios, many of the debates we have now about electricity, communications, these are things which is very hard for us to know with any definitive certainty what the law is today. We have to go back to ancient agricultural examples in the Mishnah and the Gemara to try and work out how things like electricity fit into this system. Every new technology is a question. So when we talk about why are we missing a Sanhedrin, why Jewish law seems to be frozen, we haven't had an authoritative body since, well, at least the last 1,500 years, which can tell us with any certainty how details of Jewish law, how new technologies can be addressed. Why is that? That is because we have this principle at the end of the Gemara of Ravina Rav Ashi Sof Hara'ah. There was a Sanhedrin that was sitting through the first, the second Mikdash period. I go through the historical aspect of it in the book. Then we have the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which sits down and fixes many of the laws, many of the details of the laws in an authoritative way. And then we have Ravina and Rav Ashi, who Rav Shri Ragon in his famous letter describes how their academy in Bavel was considered authoritative. The other rival academies, recognizing Rav Ashi's greatness, subordinated themselves to Rav Ashi and said, look, we are going to accept his rulings. And at that stage in history, these other academies, between them, they represented all or the vast majority of Jewish scholarship. And we had this state of Jewish scholarship where one academy that was really accepted by the entire Jewish people, which gave it, according to many of the commentators, some kind of Sanhedrin-like status. And we haven't had anything since then. So Ravina and Rav Ashi, the end of the Gemara, they finalized the Halakhic rulings of the Gemara. And the rulings that we have in the Gemara are considered Sof Hara'ah, the end of innovative legal rulings. And the problem is that was 1,500 years ago. So in terms of defining, details of Jewish law, any new law that comes up now, a question of whether a certain new appliance is prohibited on Shabbat, at what stage a person is considered to no longer to be alive in terms of organ donation, all these questions, we have to go back to these ancient sources and try and debate and compare and contrast different matters to see if they're similar. So that's a matter of the Halakha being in exile. Instead of having a Sanhedrin today, we're able to address and define with clarity some of these issues. We end up going back to making parallels and arguments over from really ancient agricultural cases. That's one dimension of it. The other thing I would say is that Jewish law, the Jewish Sanhedrin, goes further than this. Everything I've said so far would be relevant to a regular legal system. Any judicial body needs to address and apply laws to new scenarios. But Jewish law goes further, and that is because we're told that the Meshech Chochmah talks about this, the Yad Malachi, the various other sources, that part of the function of the Sanhedrin is that they are supposed to be sensitive to the needs of each generation, and they are supposed to legislate the details of Torah law in order to maximize the relevance to the generation in question. And to us, this seems like such a foreign concept because we haven't had a Sanhedrin for so many years. And especially with all the various pushbacks we've had over conservative and Reform Judaism, who are very much advanced the idea that even now we can change aspects of Torah law. Orthodox Judaism generally seems to say that we need a fully formulated Sanhedrin in order to do that, without getting into too many details. But because there's been this sort of pushback, when we say revere the status quo, we've come to very much think of the laws which were passed in the Mishnah and in the Gemara as being sort of sacrosanct and the ideal state of Judaism. And the idea that we are supposed, in an ideal state of the Jewish system, to have an active body, a Sanhedrin, to change and apply laws, details of laws, again, not the core aspects of every mitzvah, but details of laws in order to maximize their relevance is something which seems very foreign to us. So these are some of the reasons. I can give an example to, if you want, of the sort of changes that Sanhedrin can make. There's a Mishnah at the end of the first chapter of Keritut, which talks about it seems like a fairly technical debate. So there's a law that a woman who has given birth, who has had has had a miscarriage, has to bring certain sacrifices, 2 birds, to complete her purification process, so that she can now enter the Beit HaMikdash or eat korbanot. And very typically at that time, in the second Beit HaMikdash, not everyone lived very close to the Beit HaMikdash, so people would come once every few years, once every 5 years, once every 10 years. And so the question comes up, what happens if a woman comes to the Beit HaMikdash and she's had several childbirths or miscarriages between her last visit? She's got to bring 3-4 lots of korbanot. So does she offer 1 set of birds or several, 1 for each miscarriage, 1 for each birth? And the rabbis argue about it one way or the other. They compare precedents, and the Sanhedrin rules more stringently that she has to bring a set of birds for each obligation. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who's the Nasi, goes out and sees that the market prices has raised up. The traders taking advantage of this ruling, and he says this isn't going to do. They're ripping off people. The market's taking advantage of people. Aren't going to be able to afford their korbanot. He says no, this is not going to do. He goes back into the Sanhedrin, and they re-sit upon the case, and they say no, we can't do this anymore. And they rule according to the other set of Tanaim. I think it was Rabbi Akiva that said that 1 korban can fulfill all of the obligations. That's just one example as to this idea that the Sanhedrin is supposed to, as again, this is not their exclusive role, but they're supposed to be taking into account the facts on the ground, and being sensitive to the needs of the generation when they're legislating. The Meshech Chochmah talks about this in his commentary to Bechukotai, when he's talking about the klalot, the rebuke, the tochacha. Part of what we're missing, which we don't even realize, he says, is we're not having a Sanhedrin because we exiled from the land, we don't have a Sanhedrin, therefore we're not able to have a Torah which appeals to our youngsters. He's talking about 1920s Germany. Yad Malachi writes this, and it's also, you find the mystics writing about this. Degel Machaneh Ephraim, who's a early Hasidic rabbi, wrote about how from his perspective, the Sanhedrin is supposed to, I think the way he puts it, each generation has a different shoresh of a neshama, and the Sanhedrin has to be sensitive to it and legislate in accordance with the spiritual needs of the generation. So it's something which is recognized from all different roots, but partly because of political and the Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, some of the battles between them, we view the idea of halachic change in a very negative way, and that's part of this idea that you mentioned, halakha being in exile. The Sanhedrin being in exile and us not being used to how halakha is supposed to work.
Where does the modern day posek come into this?
So the modern day posek, well, that gets into a different question of when there is no judicial body. when
Right.
there is no authoritative judicial body, we said, Ravina Ravashi Sof HaRa'ah, that the end of the Gemara is considered some sort of ceiling of innovative ruling. So how much flexibility is there for a modern posek to change things? And that is, I mean, that is really the whole section B of the book, that there are different groups of Rishonim that approach this differently. You've got the Rambam, the Rif, and the Gaonim, who are generally much stricter in terms of how to apply Talmudic law to the modern era. So when questions come up, they're much more likely to say, well, that is the law as expressed in the Talmud, even though it doesn't seem so relevant to us nowadays. Well, that they were authorized to legislate, we are not. So even though, for example, my machronim doesn't seem to be so necessary for us, we still do it. We can't change it. Even though we're not going to make instruments or fix instruments on Shabbat by clapping and dancing, if that status is the law, then we will keep it regardless. Whereas but the Balei Tosafot and other Rishonim are more likely to try and say, well, it was legislated in the Mishnah and the Gemara, well, that was under a certain set of circumstances, which isn't relevant now. Therefore, inbuilt within that ruling is some kind of ability to be flexible, and more power is delegated to the modern day posek. So that opens up a whole new question, which essentially is a battle between, I guess you call it the old Sepharad, the classic Sepharad Rishonim, who applied this more strictly, and the Balei Tosfot on the other end of the extreme, who are much freer in understanding their rights, their authority to interpret and to contextualize Talmudic rulings. And we're probably the modern day posek is somewhere in between those two. It's
Briefly, before we get into the second point regarding Rambam's two-tiered system, I wanted to ask you if you can just briefly go into what gave the Talmud its binding authority. I think this is a very important point that a lot of people have never considered.
It's something which there's a measure of debate about it, to tell the truth, because al pi Torah she'arucha, the Torah gives authority to a Sanhedrin. I mean, if you take it very literally, it's a Sanhedrin, it's a judicial body made up of Kohanim, maybe exclusively or primarily of Kohanim, who are sitting in their chambers next to the Beit HaMikdash. That is the recognized, authorized body in the Torah, in the written text of the Torah. But we know historically that authority has been wielded by courts, by Sanhedrin, even who are not made up exclusively of Kohanim and who are not sitting in these chambers. So a number of commentaries, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman is one, Chacham Fa'or is another, I've seen some others, they understand that the Sanhedrin represents the national rabbinic authority, so to speak. When you have a recognized rabbinic authority, which is accepted by all, the majority, I don't know exactly how you define it, but it is seen as the recognized authority among the Jewish people, then that can have the same level of authority as a Sanhedrin to interpret things. We saw there was a Bet Din in Yavne, in various other places after the destruction, which was seen as authoritative. It wasn't made up fully of Kohanim. So we see there's some level of, yes, the Torah sets out certain conditions of what an authoritative court is, but it's not exclusively that. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was in the north of Israel. He created a Mishnah that seemed to have that was accepted as having a binding authority. But then after Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, there was the general movement over towards Bavel. For a while, though, the Jewish people were split between Bavel and the land of Israel, and there was certainly no unified acceptance of Jewish authority until we get to this time of Ravina and Ravashi and their Academy in Surah. And this is an important point for those who've read the letter of Shirira Gon, the Igeret Shirira Gon, which is a really, really important work that people should read as an introduction to the Talmud, alongside the Rambam's introduction to the Talmud. And he goes through to explaining how each of the rival academies in Bavel, you had Pumbedisa, you had Surah, you had these various academies, how they recognized the greatness of Ravashi, and he brings Talmudic sources to show how these academies therefore subordinated themselves, their legal rulings to Ravashi. By that stage, by the way, there'd been a high level of persecution in the land of Israel. The Yerushalmi had finished being written, the Jerusalem Talmud, and the primary scholarship of the land of Israel had either migrated or been communicated to Bavel, which is so the scholarship of the land of Israel you find within the Bavli. It incorporates a lot of the scholarship of Israel. So it's not just Bavel's academies which are subordinating to Rav Ashi. The Babylonian scholarship at this stage it encompasses the Palestinian, we call it, or the land of Israel. People don't like when I use that phrase. The Israeli, the Jerusalem Talmud. There's so many sugyot that the Mishnah is brought, and the first voices we hear are Amar so and so, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, who is the one of the main figures in the Yerushalmi, or Ki Ata Rabin, or so on. He brought with the message of Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan is so revered within the Bavli that his rulings are adhered to over Rav, who is a primary Babylonian Amorah. So that you got all the scholarship from the land of Israel, plus all of the academies within Bavel. And Rav Shrira shows that they were all subordinating themselves to Rabbeinu Rav Ashi, to the extent that you now have Torah Gedula b'Mokom Echad. You have this unified authority in the yeshiva of Surah for, I think it's 70 or 80 years. And Rav Ashi, according to this, Rabbeinu and Rav Ashi, they held the same sort of status as Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. They were seen as the unified Halakhic authority, and that gave them some kind of quasi-Sanhedrin status, national rabbinic authority status, which is why the Gemara says what they made in Surah was not going to be easily undone. And that's we said about them, Rabbeinu Rav Ashi Sof Hara'ah, because I think it was the year 499 in Surah, there was a big pogrom, a big exile. Jews were scattered all over even further out again. And from that time onwards, we haven't had any sort of unified system. So that was really the last time we had some kind of recognized central rabbinic authority that could be seen as in the place of the Sanhedrin. So that is what gives the yeshiva in Surah this unique status.
I'm wondering, theoretically speaking, since today with communication is so much easier than then, I wonder if we were to have a unified system today, you don't even necessarily need to have everybody in one place like back then, because communication is not necessarily it's doable to have a central unified system, even people from America and from wherever, because it's just we're not at the same our level of communication makes it plausible now. I'm just wondering, theoretically.
Just a point to raise, just saying you could have a Sanhedrin type body who are all on some kind of Zoom forum, and they can debate and come to some kind of decision that way.
Communication is
a suggestion, yeah.
Communication is the easiest thing to achieve today, literally.
So you could have not a full Sanhedrin, which with all its powers, but some kind of rabbinic authority. It could. I mean, the problem we have today is that there's been so much fragmentation and splintering into different groups, and rabbis of each group are so used to being able to have full halachic authority over their followers, over their subgroups, that no one's in a hurry to give that up, and to what do you call it, the flexibility or the humility or whatever you want to call it, to say, look, we're all part of Klal Yisrael, we're not just our group, and therefore we're going to look together and find the 70 greatest sages, or however many it is, and come to legal rulings together. So I don't see it happening in a hurry in our generation, but yeah, please God, yeah, we definitely do need it, as I discuss in the book.
For sure. Okay. And we wanted to know if you can get into Rambam's two-tiered system. You bring up a very, very, to me at least, it was a chidush. I never realized what you uncovered when you looked into the Moreh HaNevukhim, and with regarding the general laws versus the details, and you have a very interesting chidush, if I may call it that, and wanted to know if you can get into that. You also brought up Christina Hayes, a very poignant point critique of her. We wanted to know if you could talk about this stuff.
Right. So it's another big topic, a big question. So at the start of Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah, and this is something which is so fundamental that Rambam puts it at the start of his introduction to the Mishnah, meaning this is something you have to have clear and internalize before you really learn the Mishnah, the Gemara, anything. He's talking about the system of transmission and revelation of the Torah. And he talks about how each mitzvah that Moshe received in the desert, he didn't just receive the few words of the written text of the Torah in which this mitzvah is expressed. Every mitzvah was received with perusha, with its explanation. This explanation encompasses the core aspects without which this mitzvah doesn't make sense. If you are told to dwell in a sukkah for 7 days and you don't have no idea what a sukkah means, so that's a bit of a meaningless commandment. So you have to have a basic understanding of the basic structure of the mitzvah. And then there are the finer details of the mitzvah, which can be determined, which can be discussed. And I'm going to quote a passage here, because in his own words, anything which was received directly from Moshe, there can be, or the prophets, it's really from Moshe, there can be no discussion about. There can be no debates, there could be no dispute, there could be no change. Anything that was received, any of this Pirush Mekubal, which represents the core aspect of a commandment, that is beyond debate. But what was not heard explicitly from Moshe Rabbeinu, min ha'inyanim hamistaragim mehem, from the matters which branch off from them. So if we can think of a mitzvah as some kind of tree, you have a central trunk and primary branches of the tree, which represents the main structure of the mitzvah, which hold it together, which define its basic function. That was transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu, and that is beyond dispute, beyond discussion. The finer branches, the small, the finer twigs and branches, the leaves, that was left open and undefined. Some of these were legislated subsequently by the sages, by the courts, through logic, Talmudic logic, but midot al-Sinai, through the hermeneutical laws. And as he goes on to say, among these finer details, there are things which fell into dispute and were debated and discussed. And that's how that's how we have so much dispute in the Talmud. In the Sefer Mitzvot, in his introduction, the Sharashim to the Sefer Mitzvot, the Rambam seems to say that the majority of Talmudic law or Torah law falls into the second category of things which were not communicated directly by Moshe to the people, but things which were left open and undefined to be discussed, debated, legislated by future sages and Sanhedrin through application of a divinely ordained system, the sort of Talmudic logic and the drashot, the hermeneutical system. And these things, these finer details that are often referred to as divrei sofrim. Divrei sofrim means rabbinic law, which is because even though they're fully Doraita, they're Torah law, but they are defined and legislated by rabbis, really, via the courts. And among this second category, the courts can revisit these details and redefine them and come up with different drashot, different hermeneutical ways of defining these details each generation. But the thing that you're referring to in terms of the Moreh HaNevukhim is that this two-tier system of having the core aspect of every mitzvah, which are almost untouchable, and then the finer details which are open to being revisited, re-legislated. There's a flexibility there. I noticed that this parallels a different discussion within the Moreh HaNevukhim, the third section of the Guide to the Perplexed, where Rambam gives his reasons for the mitzvot, the Taamei HaMitzvot, and he again there distinguishes between the core aspects of every mitzvah, which he says have reasons for them, which we can propose and understand and appreciate, and then the finer details of every mitzvah, about which we don't necessarily look to understand why these reasons were legislated. And it occurred to me that maybe there's some kind of crossover between these two different systems of core functions of a mitzvah and finer details. And this was during the Corona lockdown, when I was sort of shut up in my room with my books for a few weeks. So I said, well, let's go through these 15, 20 chapters of Guide to Perplex, and I wrote down every single detail of a law which the Rambam draws upon when he is suggesting reasons for the mitzvot. I said, well, let's have a look at them. People think that he doesn't draw on any details at all. He brings in quite a lot of details. But when you look up these details in the Mishnah Torah and other places, you notice that he doesn't bring any detail which arises from a drasha, which arises from a hermeneutical, what we call the very soft rim, a finer detail of a mitzvah, which was legislated by the courts, which is flexible, which could be changed. All of the details he brings are things about what he says this was a tradition which was transmitted from Moshe Rabbeinu, or some equivalent phrase, which is fascinating, because what you see really is there's some sort of crossover here, and it makes a lot of sense. Why is that? Because if there's, as we said before, the core aspect of every mitzvah represents its primary function. So if you're going to look for a detail of a mitzvah, it makes a lot of sense to say we're going to look at the primary aspect of that mitzvah, not the finer details. But these finer details were not defined, they were not transmitted by Moshe, they were not just transmitted through prophecy, and they're open to be changed. They could be disputed. One Tana could say Asur, one could say Mutar, and the Sanhedrin could vote one way in one generation and revisit that and vote a different way in another generation. So how can you look at these flexible, non-transmitted laws and say, that now, in view of that law, I can understand the function of this mitzvah? It can't. It's flexible, and it wasn't received from Moshe. So that is why we see this overall system makes a lot of sense. That really we have this two-tiered system, which the core aspects are directly revealed, perfectly transmitted, no change, no dispute, and they embody the core part, the function, the God's will, as we could call it, behind the law. And then the finer details, which are defined and legislated by these sages, by the Sanhedrin, they can and must be revisited based on the needs of the generation, based on the Talmudic logic. And we say that they do not necessarily reflect the divine will. They're part of some sort of broader system. When you mentioned Christina Hayes, she has a project, the book "What is Divine About Divine Law," I think it's called.
Yeah.
And she is contrasting the Jewish philosophy of law with that of the Christians and the Hellenists. And she has an overall theory she's trying to reach, which is that the Jewish approach to law is very different. It doesn't see law as untouchable and divine, as opposed to the Hellenist view of divine laws being universal and untouchable. But all of the examples she brings to show that Jewish law is flexible and can be changed and isn't seen as divine, they all relate to these finer details of law. As I show in my book, there are many examples where one Tana will propose or say, well, let's change this law. I've got a Kal V'chomer. And Rabbi Yochanan turns around and says, if you do that, I'll put you in Cherem. I excommunicate you, because that's a received tradition. That's part of the we have discussions between the Tanaim. There's a Mishnah in Yevamot where they're discussing where a certain sort of person can convert, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai proposes a Kal V'chomer to go to the law should be one way, and the sages turn around and say to him and say, if what you're saying is a received tradition, we will accept it, because we can't challenge a received tradition. And if you're just expressing a received tradition as a Kal V'chomer, fine, we stand back, because that came through the tradition. But if you are proposing a new law through your logic, we have a counter svara. We think that we can rebut your suggestion. So we see that this is, when you're sensitive and you're aware, this is why I say it's an introduction to the Talmud. When you're sensitive and aware to this two-tier system, and we'll give some examples later on, it opens your eyes up to so much of the inner dynamic of the Talmud and what's going on there. And it answers other questions as well. There's a long essay by the Havat Yair, by Yair Bacharach, who is really troubled by this idea of how can there be so much dispute and within the Talmud. How can our tradition have come down to us with so many arguments? You open up the Talmud and every law seems to be disputed. He says, well, does this undermine the transmission of Torah? How can it be? How do we know fulfilling God's will or not? And he says, well, there are some rabbis that suggest that the Torah was initially transmitted in some pristine way, and over the generations it's been forgotten. Well, he says, well, that can't be, because if you say so much of our law has been forgotten, how can we have any trust in the tradition that's come down to us at all? And furthermore, he says, some of the disputes are over basic everyday laws, how you recite the Shema, how you put on tefillin. These are things which would have been carried out every day, brachot. How can people, and I understand if it's a once in a year, once every few years, or a rare halakha, maybe people forgot it. But something which is done every day, it doesn't make sense to say that was forgotten. So he's not happy with that. He brings in one of the mystical approaches, which was quoted in the name of the rabbis from France, that I think the Ritva quotes it, that for many of the laws, Moshe didn't just receive one fixed halakha, but he received multiple options. 49 ways of tumah, 49 ways of tzara. He received different possibilities to prohibit and to permit different. And he says this also makes a nonsense of the halakha, because does God want me to eat this food or not? And especially the Havat Yair is a Kabbalist. He's understanding that if something is not kosher, then there's some hidden spiritual klippah or damaging force within it. So he says, well, this just makes a nonsense of the Torah if you take such an approach, because either there's something damaging and bad in that food, or there isn't. How can you say that both are options and the rabbis and Sanhedrin can just choose between them? What is the function of Torah then? I mean, the Rambam's two-tiered system explains this beautifully, because if we say that the primary divine will within each mitzvah is the core aspect, that, says the Rambam, was transmitted perfectly. There was no there's no dispute, there can be no discussion, and it's only within the finer details that any dispute can creep in. And those finer details were left open and undefined, and they could be disputed. And that's not that the fact that the dispute does not reflect any problem in the transmission of the Torah, and it also means that you're not worried about how it reflects God's will, because God's will refers primarily to that core aspect which defines the main framework of the law. So that is where the two-tiered system comes in.
Few points that I jotted down. First, regarding the Moreh HaNevukhim chidush that you brought out, to me, the consistency that you see with Rambam between all his writings, right? Because you're learning his introduction to the Mishnah, you're learning Mishnah Torah, and then all of a sudden you go to Moreh HaNevukhim, and Moreh HaNevukhim is a whole ball game on its own, and it's this talking about prophecy and how to understand psukim and philosophy, all that, and yet you're able to see how consistent he is, that everything that he is, and he wrote the introduction to the Mishnah where he brings out the points that you're mentioning when he was a young boy. Moreh HaNevukhim he writes when he was towards the latter part of his life, yet he is using seamlessly without, meaning if you wouldn't have brought this out, no one would have noticed, at least not to our knowledge, at least, right? But he's actually consistently taking all the points he made in the introduction to the Mishnah and fitting it in with the Taamei HaMitzvot in Moreh HaNevukhim beautifully. It's like the consistency that he has, you don't see that anywhere.
Yeah, that's one thing which really appealed to me about the Rambam, is that before I started studying his works properly, I say Judaism was like a big mishmash of different weird and wonderful teachings, and this teaching and that teaching. No, it's all sort of a big mishmash floating around. No idea how to structure it into any kind of system. And the one thing that particularly the Rambam's Hakdamot, his introductions and some of his systems of thought really structured Judaism for me, and that's I guess something I'm very grateful for.
It's amazing. And also I wanted to mention regarding the Christina Hayes, we love Christina Hayes when it comes to stuff like polemics and different things. She's absolutely brilliant. But I think this because what struck me when I read with Christina Hayes is that her mistake was so fundamental here. it's so fundamental, and it kind of opens your eyes. The problem with trying to sometimes read scholars into things like the fundamentals of Torah or the fundamentals of Mesorah, there are things that are bound to be missed because they're coming from the outside in. It just there's
Right.
things.
I'd say there are many Jewish scholars that aren't
No
sensitive to
disrespect,
this
because we
two-tier
love
system as well, but yeah, it's definitely something I think the nuance you miss.
Yeah, huge. No, I mean it's fundamental. That's the problem there. I wanted to ask you. You touched upon it with the Havat Yair. I think he brought, because when he brings the opinion that well, I don't know if it's necessarily this one, but the if I'm not mistaken, in Ibn Daud brings the reasoning from Machloket, because lo shimshu et rabban kol tzarcho, something, they didn't do a good job of receiving it, right? I believe it's quoting a Gemara somewhere, if I'm not mistaken. The Rambam kind of understands that Gemara differently. I think he touches upon it in his introduction to the Mishnah. I don't remember offhand how he understands that Gemara, but he says that Gemara doesn't mean that, right? In the introduction to the Mishnah.
Right. But the question is why they didn't, why they weren't mishamesh, why they didn't learn sufficiently from the, say, I mean, Rashi, the Rambam, many people discuss it, and the Hilchot Mamrim also. There was, if you look at the historical context, what was going on at the time, the time of Hillel and Shammai, there was I think it was Yanai and Herod. There was a huge persecution of Torah scholars. They were sent into exile. A bunch of them were killed. It was very hard to convene any kind of Sanhedrin, any kind of proper yeshiva, and therefore disputes arose, and because it wasn't resolved in one generation, it kept perpetuating until you ended up with many unresolved cases. So it's not. There's an aspect of it that yes, perhaps they weren't intellectually attuned to what their teachers were saying. But part of it very much is the historical context, that there wasn't the Rambam. It's a big point of the Rambam that in order to succeed intellectually, you have to have the correct setting. And when you have huge civil wars and you have kings who are chasing down and pursuing Torah scholars to kill them and sending them into exile, it's not going to be very easy for students to sit calmly and understand everything that their teachers are telling them. So that's the sort of time where you had the disputes proliferating.
Okay. So yeah, I was just wondering if Rambam can be can it fit with Ibn Daud's reasoning? Do they work together, or
there was forgetfulness?
Yeah.
It could be. I don't know. I don't want to get too into that because I didn't go through Ibn Daud properly to.
No worries. No worries. One last thing I wanted to ask you before we move on to the next question is, can you get a little into Dinim Uflaim? And how that goes with the two-tiered system? Is it a third, or is it part of the two-tier?
So Dinim Muflaim, this is taken from, it's a phrase that the Rambam writes in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah. So this very much the second section of this two-tiered system. These are the laws which are left undefined by Moshe in the desert. And we'll give some examples of this a bit perhaps later on. I've got the example of Shema.
So what I'm trying to get at, so the second tier you defining Dinim Uflaim is everything in that second tier. Yes,
anything which was not heard explicitly from Moshe, it was not part of the written Torah, and it was not part of what he called the Perush Mukubal, the received and transmitted explanation from Moshe. Those things are fixed and can't change. Anything else was left open, and it was deliberately left open for courts and sages to discuss and dispute, as to legislate this in the future and to be revisited. So these are. In his introduction to the Mishnah, he calls them the Inyanim HaMistaragim. In different works, he's got different. The introduction to Mishnah Torah, he refers to them as Dinim Muflaim. These I'm not sure exactly how to translate that, but the laws, they're basically these laws which are left open and undefined, specifically so that different generations, different courts could address them how they saw fit.
Okay, so let's get into the third question. Having established that the finer details of Torah law are left to the sages to derive and develop, as you were just discussing, the listener is bound to be troubled by this. Can aspects of Torah law, which are derived from a close reading of the Torah's text, using a system that is understood to originate from Sinai, really be viewed as independent from God's will? If the details that they produce do not advance the purpose of the commandment, as you described, why then is their precise formulation the subject of such fierce and intricate debate and extensive Talmudic focus? This is a good question, because if, like you just mentioned, these are not necessarily part of the divine will from the standpoint of how the details come out, why are they fiercely arguing over these so vehemently in all over the Talmud?
Right, it's a difficult question. It's something which I think draws some criticism from other Maharal and others who don't like the Rav Hirsch, some who don't like the Rambam's second tier system. If he goes too far, they critique this point. But on the other hand, it does explain many things. But the first point we'll say is what do we mean when something is God's will or not God's will? So I'm going to start off with a teaching from the Meshech Chochmah of Meir Simcha Devinsk in his Meshech Chochmah at the start of Shofetim, I think it is. He talks about how there are a number of things we find in the Torah which can be considered God's will, but not directly God's will. For example, we have a law that we have to obey a king of Israel. David HaMelech is there. There's a law that you have to follow what the king says. Does that mean that every tax, every piece of land law, every piece of legislation the king brings reflects God's will? Not necessarily. God may think that tax bracket is too regressive, but God wants you to obey the king, and therefore that becomes biblical law. You can't rebel against the king. He says a similar thing when it comes to Apir Torah She'arucha. It may be a rabbinic law. The rabbis may make a certain piece of legislation, and the Torah wants you to obey the rabbis. Does that mean that God thinks necessarily that this detail of rabbinic law is correct? Would God necessarily have wanted that? You can't necessarily state that. God set up a system by which he wanted the king's authority to be obeyed, and a system by which he wanted rabbinic authority to be obeyed. And we find that the famous Agadata with the oven of Achnai, this is reflected very strongly. And I think that is actually biblical law, that the case involved whether a certain oven which has been put together, whether this oven can become ritually impure or not. And it's quite a complicated, it's definitely a detail of law. It's a very detailed discussion of a certain type of oven which can be put together in a certain way. And Rabbi Elazar and then Horkanas and the rabbis are arguing back and forth. And the way it's depicted in the Agadatza is that God thinks that Rabbi Elazar ben Horkanas is correct, and these miraculous signs seem to endorse the view of Rabbi Elazar, but it doesn't matter. Rabbi Elazar, it doesn't matter that the God endorses him because the majority of rabbis go the other way, and God says, "Nitzchuni b'nai, you've defeated me." Why? That's making the point that God's general will is that the rabbis be obeyed. The majority of rabbis, the Sanhedrin, the king, be obeyed. The system that he set up be followed, regardless of whether each individual law necessarily is seen to be according with his will. That's the starting point. And by the way, that makes a lot of sense of this concept of Elu ve'elu divrei Elokim Chaim. We say about disputes in Torah law, these and they are the words of the living God. Well, if God says that, if God wants this piece of food, considers it to be non-kosher, and the rabbis have voted that it's kosher, how can both sides be the words of the living God? Whereas if you say God has set up a system, and God has endorsed the system and given over the keys to the system, the forms of logic, the hermeneutical laws, he's given over the keys to us and said, you go ahead, and as long as you are seriously pursuing in accordance with the system I've given you, everything you say in terms of these details of Torah law, not in terms of the primary core aspects, in terms of the details, all of that can be seen to reflect God's will. And therefore, we have a dispute between, let's say, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda about many aspects of Shabbat. Rabbi Shimon says it's permitted, and Rabbi Yehuda says it's not permitted. So we'll say what? According to one, the other one was Mechalel Shabbat every week? No, they were both following a system which God had divinely endorsed. But that doesn't fully answer your question, because the question, why was it set up this way? Why do we have these many details of Talmudic law which are so discussed, and if they don't really directly reflect God's will and the purpose of the commandments, and they can be changed and re-legislated by a court, as the Rambam says at the beginning of the second chapter of Hilchos Mamrim, any law which a Sanhedrin rules upon on the basis of a drasha can be revisited and ruled the opposite the following generation. So if these things are so flexible that they don't necessarily reflect God's absolute will, why are they so intensely debated and discussed? Why do you get so worked up about it? And we see the Gemara definitely does get very worked up about it. So we can't do full justice to this. This is the whole chapter 4 of my book, which it goes through a lot of sources and discussion. But really, it gets into the question of what is the function of Talmud study altogether, which is a big topic for the Rambam. So in the end of the 4th chapter of Hilchot Yisodei Torah, he talks about, the primary religious directive of the Rambam is to gain some kind of intellectual connection, knowledge of God, and the highest form of that is called Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkavah, knowledge of the forms of creation and of how God runs the world, so to speak, through the Malachim, through the celestial bodies, whatever exactly that's understood to mean. But the Rambam has a strong warning there. He says before you even start pursuing all of this, before you get into the parades, before you try to enter the parades, the of esoteric knowledge, you have to first have lined your stomach with the Havayot of Abai and Rava, with the Talmudic explorations and the intricate discussions of Abai and Rava. And if you look at the Talmudic passages, Abai and Rava typically are discussing the very fine minutiae of Talmudic law. And as Rav Kapach understands it, the Rambam in the Moreh HaNevukhim talks about how before you go into esoteric knowledge, you have to train your mind in various disciplines. Your mind has to be set up correctly. And the Talmudic logic and going through and debating and discussing and getting involved in Talmudic debates, part of the function of that is that it fulfills the rational and the logical debates you go through. And I give many examples of how and why this is in the book. I can't get through all the sources now, but those strengthen and train your mind to be able to then approach and try to understand the more esoteric aspects of Judaism. From a simpler perspective, departing slightly from the Rambam here, Rav Soloveitchik in Halakhic Man has a pretty similar idea. He talks about how Halakhic Man looks at the world and sees everything in Halachic categories and through Talmudic logic, sees a beautiful sunset and is calculating the time of Shkia, sees a beautiful waterfall and is calculating whether that's considered which type of mikveh it's considered. Basically, and our engagement with halakha, with the details of halakha, it's constant. In the ideal system, we don't have a shulchan aruch just to pull off the shelf to look up a bottom line halakha. As it's supposed to be, we go through life, and there are so many mitzvot, and there's so many things we are instructed to do and not to do. Pretty much everything we're doing, whether it's business, whether it's walking in the street, whether it's eating food on Shabbat, especially tefillah, we're constantly confronted with halachic questions. And when we're confronted with a halachic question, we're not just looking for a dry answer. We have to start thinking, well, what is the Talmudic law? How does it apply to my situation? Is it similar? Is it dissimilar? Is that you're constantly supposed to be engaging with Talmudic logic, and it's supposed to be on your mind the whole time. So this training, as Rav Kapach puts it, that it's Talmudic logic and discussion, which prepares your mind for approaching God and the esoteric knowledge. It's something which is supposed to be on your mind constantly as you go through the day. just to give a few examples of how the Talmudic reality, the way it approaches laws, very often we find things like the mafreya, that Talmudic law looks beyond the normal idea of time. The laws can apply retroactively. Space and time are much less fixed, and these are things when you look in the Moreh HaNevukhim to try and esoteric knowledge, or the esoteric forms of knowledge. Also, we talk about God being beyond time. So there are very many aspects of Talmudic wisdom, quantity and quality, about whether something is in the same category and different. It's hard to really go into details here, but there are many aspects of Talmudic wisdom which parallel some of the forms of mental training you're supposed to undergo in order to enter the Parades, the esoteric knowledge. And Talmudic wisdom and constant engagement with them through these details of the commandments mean that you're constantly engaging with them and training your mind in this sort of way. So that is why I think these details of the mitzvot, even if we say they don't necessarily reflect the direct divine will, it's certainly the divine will that we are engaging with them and training our mind to be able to, so to speak, know God and approach the esoterics better.
So you're saying that when the Tanaim and Amoraim were debating these things so intensely, they were aware of the fact that they were, in a sense, they were cognizant that these debates and this process was going to also lead them into a sort of if we can call it a mystical element to it as well. That they are
right. I think there's a bright time that the Rambam sort of paraphrases that Davar Katan is the Havayat of Abba and Ravan, Davar Gadol,
right.
the great.
So there's no reason to assume that, right. So then they would have also understood that these debates in the Beit Midrash was really setting up for something greater.
Right. I mean, this is a parallel to all the mystical literature. We talk about how when you learn Torah, the Shekhinah comes down and you connect to it, and you're spiritually you're refining your mind spiritually. Halakhic man talks about this. I think the Rambam, he phrases it much more in terms of the training your mind to be enter the paradise. But the basic structure of the Talmudic logic, refining your mind, improving your mind, and enabling you to connect upwards and get a more divine perspective, so to speak, that we find throughout the Jewish literature, the Talmudic literature, the philosophers.
So how does that square with the general attitude of Old Sepharad and of the Rambam, that Talmudic law should be learned to arrive at the Halakha? Because what you're saying right now is that it's not just about arriving at the Halakha.
Right, definitely. I think that's a big topic. It's a whole other
bigger thing. I'd love to get into
it. It requires both, because the problem it really needs to be a balance. I think if you look at most learning before the advent of the Shulchan Aruch, there was no distinction between Talmud Torah and studying Halakha. It went together. Typically, both Sepharad and Ashkenaz, they generally studied in order to reach Halakha. The Gemara did it. You got all these Habayot, and Rambam, all these intricate discussions, but it was always to arrive at Halakha. And when there's no apparent Halakha, they'll ask, "My nafkamina." You're giving me this question, well, what was the difference? If there's no halachic difference, then what are we discussing it for? But sometimes the halachic difference is so fine and it's so unlikely that, but as long as there is a halachic difference, we'll take it into account. For example, the halakha, the Gemara will debate whether it's kilayim, whether it's a forbidden mixture for leading for plowing or for leading a carriage with a goat and a fish, which have both been harnessed. These are questions which are impractical, but as long as there is a halachic nafkamina, we will discuss it. So it's two functions here, because on the one hand, you want to make sure that studying halakha is supposed to be not just finding out what to do, but it's a constant process of training your mind. Because again, things weren't codified in the ideal state. You had to go back to the Gemara, so to speak, and try and work out how to apply it to your situation. So it's automatic you were involved, even in trying to find out the halakha. It wasn't just a matter of quickly look up the Shulchan Aruch and I've got the answer, fine, move on.
Right.
The whole process, and there was a lot of opposition to the Shulchan Aruch, the Maharal, the Maharshal. Many rabbis were opposed to the Shulchan Aruch specifically for this reason, because you are supposed to be involved in Talmudic wisdom. You're supposed to go back to the Gemara and try and work out what the halakha is, because the Gemara is the ultimate authority, and you should be codifying things subsequently. But there's also an aspect that without halakha, and this is something which I discussed in chapter 7, which was a result of the Shulchan Aruch, because you had halakha easily codified. Well, what's Talmud Torah now? So you had this whole advent of pilpul, in which Talmud Torah, Torah study became completely detached from any practical rulings.
That would not be considered Havayot the Rava.
No, because it's been detached and it becomes almost a goal in its own right. To the extent that this is again quoting of Soloveitchik in Halakhic Man, he says that the rabbis in Brisk looked down upon those who were issuing practical halakhic rulings. And the ideal was just to study Torah, to clarify abstract legal principles, specifically not wanting to relate it to the practical. Whereas if you look at the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rishonim, they were all they saw it as it was a symbiotic process, the way I put it. The Halakha kept the Talmudic logic grounded. You weren't discussing these strange principles that don't seem to have any practical nafka mina, any practical application. Whereas on the other hand, the fact that halakha hadn't been codified meant that even when you're discussing basic halakha, you're also necessarily involving principles. And that's the basis of Talmud Torah. When you look at the end of the first chapter of Hilchot Talmud Torah, the Rambam, he says that at least a third of your time of Torah study has to be involved in Gemara. And part of what a Gemara is, eventually the whole day, he says, it should be concentrated on all of your Torah time. But he says, well, what is Gemara involved? Midamer davar davar. It's the logical process, comparing one method to the other, looking at comparisons, looking at fine distinctions, tracing matters back to their sources, applying the hermeneutical laws. These are all things which train the mind. And this is a necessary part of the Talmudic process. But once these are split into halakha, just getting the basic halakha, putting it off the shelf, and then this ungrounded form of Talmud Torah, where it just sort of goes off and it's completely unconnected to practical halakha, the two systems move off, and neither one is working its ideal way. And when you find when Yosef Karo first wrote the Shulchan Aruch, there were great rabbinic authorities at the time who were not happy with him for this reason. Again, it was necessary because of what was going on at the time, but that's a different historical discussion.
Okay, beautiful. Yeah. So this mental processing that would lead to Maaseh Merkava or higher level, it still has to be within the process that leads to halakha. It's the principles and the processes and everything that goes into arriving at the halakha. It's not that you just gained the halakha that way, but you also gained a settling of the mind or a heightening of the mind towards something hopefully greater.
Right. We talk about Torah and Maaseh and all of that. Ideally, it's supposed to all go together. There's no distinction. If you look at the stories of the rabbis, they're walking in the marketplace, and this question comes up. It's all lived. It's all part of their life. They're going through. One of them is working in a field. It's a time for Kriyat Shema, but these are practical questions that are coming up, but they're resolving it through Talmudic wisdom. That is the ideal. It's not supposed to be this bifurcated system of someone sitting there making a list of halachot and someone else sitting there writing out abstract legal theories. It's all supposed to be one organic system which we live within our life.
Live in our life, yeah. Got you. Beautiful.
Amazing segment.
That was great.
And the last question, if you can go into detail about which laws could be potentially altered.
So how do we tell which details can be changed, which details in a sugya of Gemara can be changed, can be open to a Sanhedrin revisiting in the future, and which have come down from Moshe as part of the tradition, which we understand have been transmitted faithfully, can never be revisited, can never be disputed. This is the million-dollar question, really, when we're learning a sugya. It's really important to distinguish, yet we don't have an absolute rule to tell us which laws, which details belong to which. And the critical question, of course, is if a Sanhedrin sets up tomorrow, we have a new Sanhedrin sitting, Harabayit, or wherever it would be sitting, well, which laws can it change? Rabbinic laws, certainly. D'oraita laws, well, we know Sanhedrin can change certain details. They can make new drashot according to Perek Bet of Hilchot Mamrim. But there are some things which we know are out of bounds. There's a Mishnah in Yevamot where Rabbi Shimon presents a kal v'chomer, and the rabbis say back to him, well, if you have this via tradition, then we can't dispute it, we accept it. If it's a new detail that you are proposing via kal v'chomer, then it's your suggestion. You've created this suggestion, so we can counter it. We have a logical response. So again, there are no absolute guidelines that we have to know with certainty how to categorize each and every law within the Talmud. But in chapter 5 of Talmud Reclaimed, I go through a number of very helpful guidelines. The first, as you mentioned at the beginning, is how central is this detail to the mitzvah? Does it relate to the basic function of the mitzvah? For example, if we don't know what a sukkah is, then we cannot meaningfully at all fulfill the mitzvah of dwelling in a sukkah for 7 days. Whereas if it's a law which relates to the details of under what circumstances we are mitzta'er, we are exempt from a sukkah because the weather conditions are too difficult. So certain details about that, or exactly what the sechach can be made out of. So certain details which don't relate to the main function of the sukkah, so those are more likely to be created by the Sanhedrin and revisitable and can be amended by the Sanhedrin. Whereas laws which relate to the core functioning and definition of the mitzvah are unlikely to be revisitable. They are likely to be part of the core, transmitted, and undisputable part. And we're going to go through some details very soon. So we're going to go through some examples very soon. The second guideline is whether it's explicit in the Torah's text. Something which is explicit in the text is unlikely to be open to amendment. The third is whether we find, this is an important one, whether we find clear disputes over this detail within the Gemara, within the Tosefta, because as the Rambam told us at the beginning, something about which there is a dispute, we know cannot be part of the transmitted transmission. So if we find a Mishnah which brings different opinions on it, then we can be pretty sure that it is a detail which can be revisited by the Sanhedrin. This is to be distinguished from a discussion over what the source is for a law. Sometimes the Gemara can know a law already, and the discussion starts, and the debate starts with, well, what is the source for this law? And sometimes different asmachtot, different potential hints in the text can be suggested. But the Rambam says that doesn't mean it is a detail which is disputed, that the law may be undisputed, part of the transmission, and the sages just may be discussing where best to find a hint to it in the text. So if there's a genuine dispute over what a law is, that is indicative of the fact that it is not part of the transmitted tradition. It is something which was developed and legislated by a Sanhedrin. Another important guideline is whether it appears in the Tanakh and how it appears in the Tanakh. For example, the mitzvah of Yibum, as it came to us through the Mishnah, it is specifically a brother-in-law of the deceased who can perform the mitzvah of Yibum with the wife of the deceased, or Yibum or Chalitza. But if we look back in Tanakh, we find episodes of Yehuda and Tamar, we find episodes of Boaz and Ruth, and there, Yibum is relevant. It's being performed or suggested to be performed by father-in-law, by more distant relatives. So the Rambam, in his commentary to the relevant passage in Vayishlach, says, well, we can look at the Tanakh, we can look at the stories that have come to us, these episodes, and it's clear that the Kadmonim, the earlier sages, interpreted the Torah more loosely. And they said, well, brother-in-law is just one prime example, maybe the ideal example of who should perform the mitzvah of Yibum. But in the absence of a brother-in-law, it would seem that other relatives can also perform Yibum. That seems to be how the earlier sages interpreted this mitzvah, according to the Rambam, Nachmanides. Whereas by the time we get to the Mishnah, that had been narrowed down, and the law as it came to us in the Mishnah is that specifically a brother-in-law performs Yibum and no other relative. And finally, there's this very interesting suggestion by someone called Rabbi Gottlieb Fischer. It's quoted in the collective writings of Rav Hirsch. I don't know a lot about this Rabbi Fischer, but he suggests that when you have a law which is counterintuitive, it doesn't seem logical to us in any way, we don't understand why any court, why any Sanhedrin would have instituted a law like this, that could be indicative of the fact that it is a tradition which came down from Moshe. It's something which, maybe it's a bit of a chok, we don't understand the exact reason for it, but it is a tradition which came to us from Moshe because we just cannot imagine why a court would have legislated this. And the example he gives is of Molech. Molech is some kind of idolatrous ceremony in which a person passes a child through fire. There's a dispute whether the child dies in the process or just passed through fire. And the Torah takes this very seriously and legislates a death sentence for a father who passes his children through this Molech ceremony. Except there's a strange exception. The pasuk says that someone who passes a mizaro from his children to Molech. And the Gemara reads this very literally, a mizaro v'lo kol zaro. Only someone who passes some of his children through Molech gets a death penalty, but not someone who passes all of his children through Molech. And it's counterintuitive. If someone has passed some children and they get the death penalty, so I thought even more so if they pass all their children through Molech, they should certainly get the death penalty. It's counterintuitive. Yet it's the law. So Rabbi Fischer says, well, something like that, we can't imagine why any Sanhedrin would have made such a legislation. Therefore, it is indicative of the fact that it is some kind of Sinaitic tradition which we've lost the reason for. So, take it or leave it. I thought that was an interesting suggestion. So those are the guidelines which I present and I go through in more detail in the book. Let's now conclude with a fascinating example of how to apply these principles, these guidelines, when looking at a sugya. And we're going to take a mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, which is something, the popular mitzvah, I guess. We do it a couple of times a day. And as we know, the Halakha is, Kriyat Shema is a Torah law. It is Deoraita. And that seems pretty straightforward, except when you look at the Gemara and Sechet Brachot, Daf Chaf Aleph, page 21, we find a very confusing little discussion there. Omar Rav Yehuda teaches that if one is in doubt as to whether one has performed the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, one does not go back and do it again. Why? Because Kriyat Shema drabanan. It is a rabbinic law. What do you mean it's a rabbinic law? It's there in the Torah. You have to recite these words when you go to bed and when you wake up. The Gemara asks that straight off. What do you mean? Kriyat Shema drabanan. The Torah states that you must recite these words in the evening when you go to bed and in the morning when you get up. No. Abaye responds, Hahu b'divrei Torah k'tiv. That requirement, that commandment, is only discussing general recitation of Torah passages. It is not specific to Kriyat Shema. So let's stop and think about this for a minute. According to the guidelines that Rambam gave us, if there's a matter of dispute among the sages, that is indicative of something which was not transmitted through the generations from Sinai, but something which was developed at some point by a Sanhedrin, which would imply that the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, if there can be a dispute as to whether it is rabbinic or a Torah law, the mitzvah or some part of the mitzvah is not going to be transmitted through the years. However, what we do find is that everyone accepts there is some kind of mitzvah here of divrei Torah k'tiv. So there are different layers to this mitzvah. If you just go and read basic pashat in the pasuk, and you got to be discussing words of Torah, when you're sitting at home, when you're walking in the streets, in the morning, in the evening. Basic Peshat is just telling you to be involved with words of Torah the whole time. Whenever you have free time, use it to be discussing or reciting words of Torah. However, it seems to be accepted by everyone within that discussion in the Gemara that there is some kind of positive commandment which relates specifically to the words b'shachbacha uvkamecha. In the evening, when you lie down, uvkamecha, and in the morning when you rise up. So that would seem to be a pirush mekubal, a transmitted law and interpretation from Moshe, which is unanimously accepted, that there is some specific mitzvah say, Torah obligation to recite some words of Torah in the evening and in the morning. But beyond that, the identity of these words of Torah that you have to recite seems to be a matter of dispute. I thought this was a little bit radical when I first developed these ideas, and I looked up the Pnei Yeshua on this sugya in Barachot, in the Shagat Aryeh, at the start of his first siman. They all say similar things, that initially there was a general requirement, biblical commandments, just to recite some words of Torah in the morning and in the evening. It seems to be the basic function of this commandment as it came from Moshe, was just to bookend your day within Torah. If the morning, when you wake up, you're reciting words of Torah, the evening before you go to bed, you're reciting words of Torah, somehow encasing your day within Torah influences everything else that goes on within. Even if you're having to spend time doing other things in the interim, everything is being influenced and is bookended within words of Torah. And that seems to be the basic function of the mitzvah as it came from Moshe, and that is undisputed. Everyone agrees there is such a mitzvah to recite some words of Torah morning and evening. However, that is not the mitzvah as it came to us today. And it would seem that at some point, perhaps it seemed during the second Mikdash era, as we'll discuss in a moment, the Sanhedrin looked around and they saw, well, 1 minute, there's a bit of a weakening in the Kabbalat al Malchut Shamayim, in the accepting the yoke of heaven and the recognizing the unity of God, and we have to emphasize that. And therefore they use their legislative power on a biblical level, according to the Halakha, that Kriyat Shema is derivation. So on a biblical level, the Sanhedrin therefore narrowed down the previously open mitzvah of B'shach B'chav Kamecha, reciting words of Torah, to require us to recite specifically the psukim of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad and the subsequent paragraphs. So after that legislation was made, we can now no longer fulfill the mitzvah of B'shach B'chav Kamecha by reciting any passage of Torah, only those specific ones that Sanhedrin have required. Not that this is a transmitted tradition to recite Shema Yisrael. The transmitted tradition was to recite words of Torah, and the function was to bookend our day with Torah. The Sanhedrin, as we discussed at the beginning of this session, recognizing the spiritual needs of the generation, then narrowed down the mitzvah and required specifically the psukim of Ol Malchut Shamayim. So, and then we find in another generation, in the famous passage in the Haggadah, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, well, he wanted to add the third paragraph of Shema to the Yetziat Mitzrayim. He wanted that to be recited at night. And he only managed to succeed in having that instituted when Ben Zoma came with his drasha, Kol Yemei Chayecha. So again, the mitzvah of B'shach B'chav Kamecha grew another time. So what we see here is where the machloket is within the sugya. The machloket is not whether there's a mitzvah altogether, but the identity of the mitzvah and which passages have to be recited. That is a matter of machloket. And once you're aware of these two different categories within Dinei D'Oraita, within Torah law, those central core parts which have been transmitted through the generations, which can never be disputed, never be discussed, and the finer details which can be subject to change. Now when we look around, once we're aware of this, it opens up our eyes to many things. For example, the bracha we say over Kriyat Shema, it's not al mitzvot kriyat Shema. It's not al kabbalat al malchut shamayim or anything like that. No, it's all to do with Talmud Torah. To the extent that, so in some situations, if you haven't said Birkat Torah, the blessings over Torah study, but you have said that Birkat Kriyat Shema, you don't go back and say the bracha of Birkat Torah again. And if you look at the details, what do we say in the bracha over Kriyat Shema? Al kein Hashem Elokeinu b'shachveinu v'kameinu shachvacha v'kamecha nasiach v'chukecha v'nismach v'divrei Toratecha. It's all about Talmud Torah. And we understand that these brachot, these blessings over Kriyat Shema, were instituted by the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, the men of the Great Assembly, at the start of the Second Mikdash. And at this stage, it would seem that the mitzvah was still undefined. It was open to recite any passage of Torah. The mitzvah was just to recite words of Torah morning and evening, to bookend our day with Torah. And that was fine. And the bracha instituted by the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah reflected that. And when at some stage, presumably in Bayit Sheni, in the Second Temple era, the Sanhedrin came and narrowed down the law to refer to specifically to Kriyat Shema, they didn't want to go and change the blessings which had been instituted by the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. So this is a prime example of how awareness and sensitivity to these principles is really opens up one's eyes when one learns the sugyot. And again, it's going to be of prime importance one day, please God, when we have a Sanhedrin again, and we want to know, well, which details of Torah law can the Sanhedrin revisit? So we will know that, for example, a Sanhedrin can go and change the details of which passages of Torah are recited at Kriyat Shema. They could say, well, we're pretty good on Ol Malchut Shamayim now, but we're not very good on Haftarei HaKamocha. So let's go and recite some passages of Torah which relate to that. And if they redefine that, then now under Torah law, we would have to say those passages instead, or as well. But Sanhedrin could never come along and say, well, the mitzvah of B'shach B'chav Kamecha, we don't think that's relevant anymore. We're going to instead have a mitzvah of Lech T'chavat Derech. Because B'shach B'chav Kamecha seems to be an undisputed Sinaitic tradition which came down to us, and therefore it could never be changed and it can never be debated, amended, or disputed. Thank you so much for this opportunity, for having me on your podcast. I've really enjoyed it, and I really hope that all the listeners have as well. Thank you.
Absolutely incredible. When we started this podcast, we said that we want this podcast to be about fundamentals. Your book personifies our podcast because this is all about fundamentals. Really and truly incredible. Thank you so much. Wishing you success in all your future endeavors. And we hope to speak to you about this book. Hopefully, maybe do a part 2 covering some other parts which are extremely important. But really and truly, the fundamentals that you discussed tonight are fundamental.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share this with the listeners. And I look forward to further opportunities in the future.
Thank you. הצלחה רבה ושבוע טוב.
שבוע טוב.
שבוע טוב.